So he is risen. That's right. It still counts even today. Could you imagine the reality of the first disciples when they realized that statement was true, that he is risen indeed? And what it leads us to is the concept that there is a God who rules, and there is a God who overrules all things. As we continue our sermon series in Exile, we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 28. And that's the title of the sermon this morning, is The God Who Rules and Overrules. I was going to give a catchy little title, Daniel in the Lion's Den, but I chose this one instead. And one of the things that we see here is we see Daniel is well in his age. He entered into exile with all of those that were from Jerusalem and Judea, and he was taken as a young man at the age of probably about 15 years old. And now he is served through multiple kings, some like Nebuchadnezzar who had longer terms and others who had much shorter terms. He rose in Nebuchadnezzar's court, and he was given favor by God. He was head and shoulders above the rest of the young men. God paired him with 3 young men that were his prayer partners, prayer warriors, and confidants. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is what we know them as. They were in the fiery furnace. They were men of great faith in a land where even their countrymen from Israel were actually submitting to other gods. And so the question is how do we live as exiles in a world that is unfaithful? How shall we live in this world as an exile? Jesus lets us know that, hey, we're in this world, but we're not going to be of it. We're going to be of His kingdom. So the first thing that we want to look at here in chapter 6, the first 4 verses that we're going to look at is that if we honor God and let Him exalt you, we have to honor God and allow Him to exalt us. We all know the story of Daniel in the lion's den, but do we really remember how it all started? The second half of the chapter really is the story about Daniel being thrown in a pit, a lion's den, and the angel of the Lord comes that evening and basically shuts the mouth of the lions. The next day, the king comes to see if Daniel was devoured, and he wasn't. And so we know that story, but do we understand exactly how it all started? And it started with Daniel, one who honored God and trusted God. And it was his faithfulness that we're going to see that actually brought all kinds of trials, but also it gave opportunity for God to overrule and also to rule Daniel's life. So if we were to look at Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, we see that Daniel was one who walked in the Spirit. How do we honor God and let Him exalt us? We have to be able to be people like Daniel that walk in the Spirit. Verse 3 says, "Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and the satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king intended to appoint him over the entire empire." You would think that if you had an extraordinary spirit and you were actually progressing in your field and your occupation, that, you know what, you would have a lot of favor from everyone else. But actually what Daniel finds in his old age, he's 80, that as he continues with this new king, who's a Persian now, he's no longer serving the king of Babylon, and he sees that it says early on that the satraps, that there's 120 of them that are appointed. And who are these individuals? These are individuals throughout the entire Persian Empire that are actually like district leaders. So there's 120 districts through the Persian Empire. And what we see is that there's 120 people to rule over them. But then Daniel was one of 3 who was a commissioner. And so those commissioners would take about 140 districts with these leaders in these districts, and these commissioners would oversee these areas. So there's 3 commissioners and 120 satraps. These are people that are ruling these smaller districts throughout the entire kingdom of Babylon. A lot of detail here. Why? Because it's a real nation. It's a real story. It's interesting that you see Daniel always constantly glorifying God, but also engaging in government. Unbelievable. Probably goes against Christian thought today in the West. We've been told by the government to stay out. But we know when godly people rule and when godly people reign, that there's a blessing over the land. And you see that with Daniel. But you also know that when evil people rule, that you know what? The people suffer. And that's true. We can look around today in Myanmar, a military coup. They're literally in the streets today shooting their own people for power. Like their own people. That's evil. They're not there to serve, they're there to rule and to control. And you see it all over the world. Now, Daniel had a tricky situation because he had to learn how to serve in a government while exalting Jesus, while exalting God, while being faithful. And what Daniel was able to do, and what we should be able to do as exiles in this world, is to walk in the Spirit. It says in verse 3 that Daniel possessed an extraordinary spirit. And if you were to look at the first 6 chapters, you're going to see over and over and over again various kings, not just Darius, but various kings saying that Daniel had a spirit of the gods or a spirit of a god. It's the Holy Spirit in Daniel, God's favor in his hand. Everything that Daniel did was not by his charisma or his character, his ability. It was done by the power of the Holy Spirit in his life. He had tremendous favor by God, and he was faithful. And so you see this well-organized government, and Daniel is one of the top 3 in the government. And he's exceeding all the rest. And this is actually the issue here. Because you see that the king had an intention. His intention was to appoint Daniel over the entire kingdom. He was going to get promoted, and everybody else knew it. So I believe that there's probably jealousy that broke out, because if you look at verse 4, then you see something happen. You see that they begin to conspire against Daniel. They want to thwart the king's plan, and they want to get rid of Daniel. But you know what? Daniel was one who served faithfully. And you see this in verse 4. It says this, "Then the commissioners and the satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel." They looked for something in Daniel's life. They started digging up, like politics, right? They start digging up in his background, digging up in his habits, digging up who's he with, how does he serve the king, how does he function? And they're digging things up to try to find some kind of ground to accuse Daniel, against Daniel regarding the government affairs. They're trying to overthrow this guy because they know that he is about to become in charge of the entire kingdom appointed by the king. And this is what it says about Daniel, because he served faithfully. It says this, "But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, because he was trustworthy and non-negligent, or corruption was to be found in him." He was above reproach. So they had an issue with Daniel because they couldn't find anything, which is uncommon. I mean, we live in a country where our politicians enter into politics broke, and they end up with like hundreds of millions of dollars by the time they retire. How did they get that? Are they that good? I don't think so. They're not charismatic speakers. They're not great speakers. It's because of negligence and corruption and self-interest over the interest of the people. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 6 reminds us that many a person proclaims his own loyalty, but who can find a trustworthy person? If you're a business owner, or if you are a manager, or if you're in charge of hiring people, or you work with other people, you'll know that it's very difficult to find people that are trustworthy. Oftentimes, you'll find resumes that are very impressive, they're very good, and man, they have all the skills and talents, but can you trust them? And that's where really the rubber meets the road. Is this person trustworthy? Are they worthy to have on your team? And Daniel was, and the king knew it, and that's why he was going to promote him above all else. Because the king saw Daniel's trustworthiness. He saw his skill. He saw that there was a special spirit on Daniel, and he had favor from God. And he was faithful. He was faithful. What's interesting here is it acknowledges the fact that as you work, and as you're faithful, and as you're trustworthy, and as you're above reproach, wherever you're at, it can be a testimony. See, Daniel was a testimony. Even his enemies knew they couldn't catch him that way. They knew that he was above reproach. And his faithful service unto the Lord, by the power of the Spirit of God, was a testimony. And what that lets us know is that the world is always watching you. If they know you're a Christian, you know what? They're watching to see what it looks like for a Christ believer to work in the workplace or to function in this world. The world is always watching us. And you know what? When the world watches us and we honor God and we are faithful to God, you know what? It's actually a positive testimony to the world of who we are and who Christ is. And that's what you see with Daniel. Second point here, and you see it in verses 5 through 15, is that we should be faithful to God even if it costs us. We should be faithful to God even if it costs us. Well, the first reason why is because you know what? Faithfulness doesn't always come in times of ease. Why? Because evil men will try to entrap godly men. And that's what these guys are trying to do with Daniel. They're evil people, and they're trying to find a way to entrap Daniel. They're trying to look for a way because they know that he is faithful, that the king he has favor with the king, and that he's about to be promoted. So they're looking for a way to actually bring an accusation. And they can't find anything in his service in government. And so they have to devise an evil scheme to entrap him. And so they take a weakness or a strength of Daniel and they try to turn it into a weakness with trickery. We see here in verses 5 through 9, in verse 5 it says this, "Then these men said, 'We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him regarding the law of his God.'" We're not going to find any accusation against this guy because he serves the king faithfully. But the only thing, because he's a faithful person, he is faithful to his God. And his God is not the God of the Persians. So we have to find some kind of conflict between our God and his God. And we got to find this accusation there. It has to be regarding his faithfulness to the law of God. So how do they do that? And so all of these commissioners and these satraps, they get together, they're very jealous, and they go to the king, and they actually ask the king, and we assume that Daniel is not present at all. And so they all come there, and they go to the king, and they basically ask the king to establish a statute for 30 days. That for 30 days, that no one will appeal to any other god or appeal to any other man other than the king himself. What that means is prayer and worship and the like. And they say that basically that if you can put it into law, the law of the Medes and the Persians, and what that means is that once it's law, that the king cannot back out of it if someone breaks the law. He has to follow through the punishment. And the punishment is to throw the individual in the lion's den. To be devoured, to be killed. They don't want this 80-year-old man to retire. They want him dead. Evil men are trying to entrap Daniel. And we know that as believers, even Jesus said that in this world we're going to have tribulations. But he also tells us to take courage because he's overcome the world. You're going to have tribulations if you live faithfully. You're going to have people that are going to look at you with jealousy, that are looking, even if they don't even realize it, that they're looking for an excuse or a way to entrap you. Somewhere deep in their spirit, they want you gone. But you know what? You have to stay faithful. You have to stay faithful. Godly men will remain faithful to God no matter what. And that's what you see with Daniel's life. You don't bend because of the situation. And when the situation turns and it's out of your control, you have to do what Daniel does. So this law was proclaimed. No one for 30 days can seek counsel or prayer or worship from any other God. And I thought it was interesting that they chose 30 days. Probably because a lot of these guys, since they're from other nations, and now they're like captives, and they're serving the king of Persia, they probably have gods that they like to worship. So they don't want it to be a permanent law. They just want it to be long enough so they can get Daniel. Another thing you got to realize is that these individuals are polytheistic. They believe in a multitude, a pantheon of gods, while Daniel has one true living God. One true living God, and that's important. So Daniel, he knows and he hears about this law. And so we have to look at chapter 6, verses 10 through 15, and see what Daniel actually did. What was his response to this law? This is a faithful man. Is he going to stop worshiping God because it's a law of the land? And he's a very wise person too. I mean, you're wise. You've walked into rooms and know when people don't like you. Daniel knows when these people don't like him, or they're jealous of him, or they're gunning for him. There's a huge group of them. And the more you are staying faithful to your God, the more enmity you'll have in this world. The more people that will come and gun after you. Even people that you serve with, like Daniel. But what does Daniel do? He's a godly man. He stays faithful. Verse 10, it says, "Now when Daniel learned that the document was signed, he entered his house, and in his roof chamber he had windows open towards Jerusalem." So he goes up onto his roof, and this is where a lot of times they would sleep because it gets so hot. And they could sleep on top of the roof, and they get the cool of the breeze. And he's kind of out in the open. This is not like some distant roof that no one can see you. This is actually a roof that is visible. The window is open. All can see. If you remember David and Bathsheba, he looks and sees her on a rooftop. It's visible. And it goes on to say here in verse 10, "And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and offering praise before his God, just as he had been doing previously." He didn't just start praying because he knew that there was this edict that was out. He continued to do what he always did. He prayed to his God 3 times a day. And it's interesting that it says that he opened his window towards Jerusalem. Right? Could you imagine that? The heartbreak of being ripped from Jerusalem, the temple destroyed. You're in a captivity, a stranger in this world, and everyone that you're serving with is gunning for you, and you know it. Now they want to take away your ability to worship a God, and now you have this great conflict about, and you're a faithful person. You're a faithful servant, even if you're serving people that aren't Jews, even if you're serving people that aren't believers. You're a faithful and loyal person, and that's innate in you. And now you know that there's this devious scheme to strip you from your God, and now you are left with the choice. Do I worship or do I not worship? And you see that he kneels before God. He's looking towards Jerusalem with this hope of returning from exile. And you see Daniel, engage in civil disobedience. He's doing it in the open. He doesn't go down in the house in a prayer closet to worship and pray. He continues to do it as he always had done it. And he's kneeling on his roof. He's praying. He's offering praise. He's worshiping before his God. What happens when a government would say, listen, you can't worship your God? A lot of times we think that, at that time that maybe, during my trials of life, the conflict, that's going to forge Christian character. In some regard, it does forge Christian character if you endure the right way. But really, what Daniel has done, he previously prayed 3 times a day. He was a person that was on a godly path even before the edict went out. He was a person that was prepared for the trial, prepared for the lion's den, a person that had already been walking with God. He didn't wait till the trial to fall on his knees and repent and come back to God. And that's how most of us approach God. It's smooth sailing. Oftentimes we'll forget about God and He's last on our priority list. But when a trial hits, when temptation hits, when issues hit in our life, then all of a sudden we begin to do something new. We begin to fall on our knees. We begin to seek God like never before. And that's a good thing. But it's even a better thing if we did it before the trial. There's preparation that happens before. So Christian character is forged before the moment of adversity. That's what we're talking about, godliness and faithfulness. Pray without ceasing is what Scripture tells us. When you pray, the Lord's Prayer, when you pray, it's assuming that we are people of prayer, people of seeking the Lord, of being strengthened by Him, being forged by Him, being developed by Him. So when the trial comes, what happens is that our Christian character is revealed. It's revealed. Oftentimes we fall apart in the trial, and it reveals actually what we're made of. Our faith is exposed, and it's revealed. One thing that we can also learn from Daniel is that he did not rely on it. 80 years old, he never gave up. We're a retirement culture, right? We're a retirement culture, but for some reason, Daniel had a very important mission well into his 80s. And he did not rely on past faithfulness as a substitute for what God was doing today. And everyone in this room, even the older generation, needs to know, as long as you have breath in your lungs, you have a purpose on this earth from God. There is no greater example of Christian character than somebody that has walked like Daniel for years and years and years, that has stories after story after story of faithfulness that they can share with the younger generation. Especially a generation today that has no faith. And no grounding, no truth, confusion. I read the other day that the number one cause of death from guns is suicide. Suicide. We live in a culture where the individual literally hates themselves. I don't like the way I am, so maybe I wasn't born this way, so I'll change everything about me. I'll emasculate my body because I'm just not happy with myself, or I'll shoot myself in the head. It's crazy that the world doesn't know that they are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and that there's a God in heaven that wants to bring them from the pit and help them and to exalt them, to bring them into a place of exaltation as children of God, men and women of God. So there's an entire generation out there that has walked with the Lord for years and years and years, and I think that they have something to say to the younger generation. As long as you have breath in your lungs, God has a purpose and a plan for you. And so Daniel, he's actually engaging in civil disobedience. Because now the edict is going directly in the face of his worship and his faithfulness to God. He has to choose at this moment, who will I serve in this moment? And sometimes in life, you'll be faced with that choice. Or maybe with the threat of death, the threat of some sort of punishment or penalty, that your faithfulness cannot waver. And if you carry on that path, you're going to have to say, I know there is a God in heaven who sees me. And He sees those that are faithful. And He is good, and He is just, and He is able to deliver. So this is really a huge step in faith. And Daniel decides to do it in the open. He doesn't hide. It's crazy. You know, it's amazing what has happened over the past year of how just basic freedoms have been restricted. And those freedoms are now beginning to infringe on our faith. Now, from the majority of our culture, if you'll see that people will say all the time that they're a Christian or they're a believer, but they're not really like Daniel. People who are devoted, that are praying and seeking God, that are completely sold out and faithful to Jesus. That group is a lot smaller than you think. But what happens when your freedom to worship your God is infringed? Even in your old age, would you have the boldness in Christ to be disobedient, but also obedient to God? What would you be willing to sacrifice for that? And that's why Daniel is a godly man who remained faithful no matter what. And so he's worshiping, and the men that were trying to ensnare him, they knew that he was going to go ahead and do this. They knew he was faithful to his God, and so they observed it. They watched it. Then they went to the king, and they reminded the king about his edict, about his order. And they said that this order and this edict, this is a law, and no matter who it is, king, you can't turn back from it. And what that reveals really is that the Persian Empire was actually a very intricate, diverse, sophisticated government where even the king could not just say, I am the ultimate authority, everyone will do what I say. He was bound. He was trying to find a way to get Daniel out of this situation, and he was grieved when he heard that Daniel was the one that worshiped his God. But I think also the king knew that he was tricked. I think he began to see the devious scheme of these other individuals. So we have to be like Daniel and place our trust in God and know that He is able to deliver us. And that's why he went through it. We see this in verses 16 through 24. We have to know that as we're faithful to God, God never calls us to not be faithful to Him. He will never do this. He will never put you in a situation where you are to be unfaithful to Him. He is not some powerless God. He is the God who rules. And when you're faithful and there are other judgments from other kingdoms or other authorities in this world, He is also the God that overrules those situations and circumstances. And Daniel knew this. He trusted in the sovereignty of his God. And we too can rest in God's plan. He knew that God had a plan, that God had a purpose, and that God's plan was not for him to just be unfaithful to Him and be faithful to the king in the law. So let's look at verse 16. It says this: Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and thrown into the lion's den. I love this. It shows you, we don't know where the king is at. We know that Nebuchadnezzar turned to faith, which is amazing. But this King Darius, we don't know where he's at, but he makes some very interesting statements. We know, one, that he loves Daniel, that he has He has desires for Daniel to be promoted. I think he sees Daniel as being a holy man, a righteous man, a faithful man. And this is what he says to him in verse 16. This is very interesting for a pagan to say to a believer. He says this, "The king said to Daniel, 'Your God, whom you continually serve, will himself rescue you.'" That's like a statement of faith. And what that does is it reveals Daniel's ongoing lifestyle in front of the king. He says, as you continually serve. The king is mindful that you, Daniel, are different than all the other people that serve in this court. The people from all over the world. You, Daniel, continually serve him. You are faithful. There's something different and outstanding about you than everyone else. And he says this, "Your God whom you continually serve will himself rescue you." He's now acknowledging that the God of Daniel, the singular God, the unique God of all the other people in the court that have all these different gods, Daniel says, "I have one." He says, "I continually serve him." And he says, he's going to rescue you. What a statement or a proclamation of faith. But also, I think in this moment, the king realizes, Daniel, that person that can rescue you is not me. I'm bound by this law. If I go back on it, I'm going to have repercussions. The king does not want Daniel to go into the lion's den. He was grieved when he found out that these men tricked him and that Daniel disobeyed the edict that went out. But he was also bound by the law. And he's saying, as I'm bound by the law, your king, your God, is the one that can deliver you. It's remarkable. Verse 17, it goes on to say, "And a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet ring of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regarding to Daniel." He would seal the ring, and it would be like a strip, and they would roll a huge stone over it, kind of like the tomb of Jesus. You see the imagery. And this was a pit, so there was probably an opening, and they had this huge seal. The stone would be there, and then they would just melt wax to make sure that it wasn't broken. And then to make sure that it wasn't broken, as they melted the wax, the king would take his, and there's only one, there's one ring for the king, and he would actually take that melted wax, and he would engrave his little ring in there, and he would have a symbol. And then he made all of the other men actually do the same thing as well. The people that are actually accusing Daniel and trying to ensnare Daniel. I would imagine at this point the king is pretty grieved, and he's really hoping that Daniel's God shows up. But also it shows you how this king is saying, listen, I can't be at blame here. You're not going to blame me for breaking him loose if something happens. Everyone's got to know that I am not, if anything happens, if Daniel is freed, if anything unique happens here, supernatural happens here, I have no part in it. I'm going to seal this tomb, and I'm going home. I'm getting away from this place. It's interesting. And he does this with desire for Daniel to stay alive, but also in hope in the God of Daniel. In verse 18, it says, "Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting." Holy smokes. Wonder where he saw fasting at. He saw it from Daniel. See, Daniel was such an influence on this king that you begin to see godly traits well up in the king's life. And he has great favor and admiration from the king. It's amazing. So he spent the whole night fasting, and then what did he fast though, right? Food probably, we don't know that, it doesn't say it. But it says, and no entertainment was brought before him. He fasted entertainment. And his sleep fled from him. He stayed up all night, fasting with no entertainment. Wonder what he did with his time. We don't know. Did he pray? Did he make a prayer or a petition to a God, or maybe even Daniel's God? We don't know. But we know that he makes some pretty strong proclamations of faith. And it's all because of the testimony of Daniel's life. So we can be like Daniel and rest in God's plan, and we can also be like Daniel and be certain of God's power. And you get the images here with what's happening with Daniel in the lion's den. And you see some images that are unique and kind of, an image of what you may see, what you saw at the resurrection of Jesus, with the stone being rolled and the tomb being sealed. And the first thing that the king does is he gets up at the break of dawn, like the women, and he runs off to the tomb, like the women did. It's amazing. Actually, the first century Christians saw this as a precursor to Christ, as being like an image of what happened in the Old Testament was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. An example would be the sacrifice of where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. He takes him up on the hill and he's going to sacrifice his son. And you know what? All of a sudden, this ram is caught in the thicket. And it says that God will provide. And on that same location is where God sacrificed His only Son, Jesus Christ, the one true living sacrifice for all of us. And so we see here, he runs at daybreak and he hurries. And Daniel, he is certain of God's power. We see this. He's just trusting in God's plan and certain of His power. And it says this in verse 20, and when he had come near to the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. You can hear the care and the concern that the king has for Daniel. The king began speaking and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions? Again, who you continually serve. Testimony. Has your God, the living God. It's really interesting because you got to understand that in a culture where they serve all different types of gods, we serve a living God. Their gods are much like the gods of today. Their gods are stone and wood and precious metals and all of these little images that they would collect, and they would spend all their money to have these images in their house. But they weren't living gods. This statement is talking about a living, one true living God. The God of Daniel, Yahweh. He says, you continually serve Him. Have you been rescued? And then Daniel's reply in verse 21. Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. He honors him. He cares for him. He understands the relationship that they have. It's amazing that they threw an 80-year-old man in a lion's den, put a stone over it, and steal it. What was he going to do, move the stone? It's crazy. And then he says this in verse 22. My God sent His angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they had not harmed me, since I was found innocent before Him, and also towards you, O king. I have committed no crime. He's blameless. He trusts. He rests in God's plan, and he trusts in the power of God. He's found blameless. And one thing that we can know is that God's plan for your life, if you stay faithful, if you do not waver, if you do not allow Babylon to seep in and you begin to worship their gods instead of your one true living God, that you will not be put to shame. That's what we know, we learned from Daniel. He says, I've committed no crime. I'm blameless. So the king actually went through the entire penalty and the punishment, and it's over. He has Daniel removed, and now the king is like, all right, I'm not bound by the law anymore, but guess what? Here's the new law. All these fools that were trying to trick me and ensnare Daniel, we're throwing them and their families into the lion's pit. And it says by the time they hit the ground, they were crushed and destroyed. Their gods were unable to save them. They were to blame. They were faithless. They were full of jealousy and envy and deceit, even to the king. and they were all instantly killed. And, I thought about it, and I was thinking, man, that's very harsh that they threw their kids and their wives in there. Like, what is going on with this? So I did a little study on it, and it's like, what you find is that when there was a traitor in the kingdom of Persia, what you find is that the punishment under Medo-Persian law was that they would actually throw their entire family in there. So it's actually in line with history of how they treated traitors. I'm not sure if that was a law, but the king followed that. Those words, though, of Daniel, my God has sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me since I was found innocent before him. And also towards you, O king, I have committed no crime. Those words in verse 21 and 22 are the only words actually from Daniel's mouth. What Daniel's not saying is that he's sinless or that he's perfect. He's not saying any of that. Daniel is much like you and I and struggles with all kinds of different things. Now, he's well into his age, so you know what? Like iron sharpens iron, one man sharpens another. You see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. By now, well into their 80s, they are very sharp, full of wisdom. The trials and the temptations and the things that they experienced early on in age, by this time in their life, they've experienced so many different things in the Lord, and they've grown in them. And even before them, as they continually sought the Lord in prayer and worship and to be faithful. Those trials and those things in the beginning were at this point in their life, a lot easier to overcome because they knew who God was. They could rest in His plan, and they were certain of His power. They've seen it over and over and over again. Oftentimes, when we try to defend ourselves, when we try to finagle a way around conflict, what happens is sometimes we actually remove the opportunity to walk in faithfulness through the conflict and actually allow the Lord to show up and deliver us. Like, if you kind of think about it, for the Israelites to actually be delivered from Egypt, they had to be slaves first. You want a miracle in your life, God's probably going to put you in some very interesting situations that you would not normally in your flesh, in your fleshly self, would want. But it's the faithful man and woman of God that will find themselves in peculiar situations. Like, I think of Esther. She's got favor with the king once again. She realizes her people are going to be killed, and what does she do? She approaches the king. She approaches the king with boldness. Now you got to remember, the first queen that approached the king was killed by that same king. She approaches, her neck is on the line, and she approaches in faithfulness and in boldness, and God moves. So we can be certain of God's power. And if we look at verses 25 through 28, we see that God will use you to make His name famous. I've pointed over and over and over again the testimony that Daniel has had. But really what you see is the name of his God, the living God, becoming famous in the ear of the king. Verse 25 through 26, the first part of 26. The first part of 26 says that, in 25 it says that the king wrote all the peoples in his empire. The largest empire, it's a global empire. He wrote all the people, all the nations, all the populations, in all of the languages, in all of his land. And he says, may your peace be great. And then verse 26 it says, I issue a decree that in all the realm of my kingdom, people are to tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. Holy smokes. And that's not the first time a king, it was the Babylonian king that went ahead and did the same kind of thing. Issued a decree and said, listen, the king, the God of Daniel is the God of all gods. And he says that we are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. So God can cause unbelievers to acknowledge His greatness. And that's what you see right here. God can cause unbelievers to acknowledge His greatness. When you look at the grand scope of everything that's happening in the world with all the nations and all the kingdoms and all the hope and trust that we put in our stuff and in the governments of our world, what God is doing is that He is vehemently opposed Babylon, which is deceitful, which is evil. And He is about His kingdom that's going to come. And His rule and His will be done on earth as it is in heaven. See, God is ushering in His kingdom through Jesus Christ, who is the King of kings and the Lord of all lords, including Darius. And so Darius agrees, and he says, all the people in his entire kingdom are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Proverbs 21 is beautiful. Proverbs 21 verse 1 says, the king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever He pleases. Let me say it one more time. The king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever He pleases. He is the God who rules, and He is the God who overrules. If you look at the second half of verse 26 through 28, which is the end of the chapter, we see that God can use unbelievers to proclaim His glory. In this same edict, you see a proclamation. After he says at the beginning of 26, he says at the beginning of 26, I issue a decree that in all the realm of my kingdom, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. First thing is we're brought right to our minds to Proverbs. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. That He is all powerful, that He is sovereign, that He sees all things, that He is in control of all things. And then it goes on at the second part of verse 26. For He is the living God, enduring forever, and His kingdom is the one which will not be destroyed, and His dominion will be forever. He rescues, saves, and performs signs and miracles in heaven and on earth. He who has also rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. That proclamation is powerful. Can you say that this morning? That He is the living God. We live in a world that serves all kinds of gods. It was known throughout the empires, from pharaohs that proclaimed themselves as being living gods, to Caesars, to Babylonian emperors, that even people could be seen as a god. In our generation, we see people look at themselves as being the ultimate authority, the ultimate possessor of wisdom. But this king is saying that there is a God that is higher than all other gods of man that they have created. He is a living God, enduring forever. It speaks of His eternity. And His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. It's not perishable. And His dominion will be forever. And I love this, and we need to know this as believers as we live as exiles in this world. Verse 27 says, He rescues, saves, and performs signs and miracles in heaven and on earth. If this is the God you serve, it's a lot easier to be bold in a world that's powerless before your God. It's a lot easier when you know that your God is the one who rescues, who saves. He's eternal. He performs all kinds of signs and wonders and miraculous events. See, Daniel and his friends knew this intimately. And the more we trust in Him and walk in faithfulness, even in the midst of great sacrifice or opposition in this world, we serve a faithful God that will show up and deliver His people. And deliverance after deliverance and move after move, you begin to understand who He really is. And I don't know where you are in your life, but you may need a hand of God in some area of your life. And it may not be from a lion's den, or it could be something like it. But can you say that about Yahweh? Can you say that about Jesus Christ? That He rescues, He saves, He performs signs and miracles in heaven and on earth for you. It's a beautiful thing because just as he wants to shut the mouth of the lions for Daniel, he wants to do the same for us. Are we walking in faithfulness? Are we walking in just understanding of his perfect plan? Do we have peace in that? I mean, I love it. Even when we look back at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? It's almost like their fiery furnace was kind of like the Daniel's lion's den. And they even said, even if God does not deliver us, we're not going to serve any other God. But he's able to. We don't presume his will. And I love verse 28 because you see how God exalts Daniel. He's faithful. Verse 28 says, so this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. He continues to serve successfully. But you know who gets the glory? God does. King after king after king proclaims the glory of the God of Daniel because Daniel was a faithful man that walked in the power of the Holy Spirit, that was blessed by God, that was unwavering in his faith. And yes, at times he was disobedient to the law. But you know what? It wouldn't be anything new for Christians to be lawbreakers in this world because we're not of this world. We're in it. That's it. We're of the kingdom of God, and that does not waver. His law is supreme. James chapter 4, verse 10 says, humble yourself in the presence of the Lord, and he will exalt you.